When the red light above the operating room came on for the first time, Yoo Jung-wook thought it was the signal for an execution. In his memory, bright lights had never belonged to rescue. They belonged to interrogation. Metal instruments did not repair bodies. They made people submit. He had been carried to that door more than once already, and each time he clutched the edge of the stretcher with all his strength, as if holding on to the last loose stone at the edge of a cliff. He refused surgery, not because he feared pain, but because he had never seen what treatment truly looked like. In the poor villages of the northern countryside, in the twilight of colonial rule, in the makeshift field tents thrown up during wartime, everything he had seen was not so much medicine as a rough means of delaying death. Those memories had been compressed into a few symbols: dim oil lamp, blood-stained strips of cloth, wounded men forced to bite down on wooden blocks, and promises of "we'll save you" that were never kept. For him, real danger had never stood at the muzzle of a gun. It had always waited under the light. In 1944, he was still a boy in a seaside village in North Hamgyong Province. Winter winds rose off the ocean and scraped across faces like blades, making no distinction between rich and poor, high and low. That was when he first understood that some forces would never change because of a person's identity. Forces like cold, like hunger, like the orders of an empire. He learned silence somewhere between Japanese and Korean, and between forced labor and the narrow spaces of a meager classroom. He learned one thing. In a world stratified by rigid hierarchies, the only thing one could rely on was seeing clearly where the violence beneath the rules truly came from. Later, the war changed flags. The slogan shifted from Imperial Army to People's Army, but the ranks he saw were just as neat, the orders just as unquestionable. Only the uniforms and banners had changed color. He rose from an ordinary soldier to a first lieutenant, learning how to secure a relatively safe position inside the new system. He believed that as long as he gripped the rope of rank tightly enough, he would not suddenly drop into the void. When the Korean War broke out, he was commanding a company on the Gangwon Province front. In the summer of 1950, the front line surged back and forth like a restless tide. Northern propaganda insisted that the Americans were nothing but paper tigers, corroded by material comfort. But he soon saw with his own eyes the uninterrupted firepower, fuel, and supplies behind those paper tigers. Tank treads carved deep grooves into mountain roads, aircraft appeared overhead like shadows that arrived on schedule, and the railways and ports under their control turned into one entrance after another for a constant flow of resources. For the first time, he realized that industrial disparity was not an abstract term. It was something specific. It meant that the enemy's shells arrived on time, while his own side had to calculate and recalculate every box of ammunition. In the winter of 1950, during a chance engagement south of the Chosin Reservoir, the company he led was pinned down in a valley. The shelling went on all night. The slopes were blasted into pitted earth. The snow took on a grey-black color in the firelight. At dawn, as he moved through a landscape of ash and smoke, counting the survivors, he discovered that a fragment had torn a deep gash into the left side of his waist and abdomen. The blood had already frozen into his padded coat. He tried to continue directing the retreat, but what held him upright was not willpower, only a numbness that had not yet spread completely. Later they were surrounded. They were forced to abandon the wounded. They were forced to make decisions in the middle of a stack of contradictory orders. When he finally collapsed, he no longer knew whether he fell into snow or mud. He only remembered a yellowish sky and the sound of aircraft in the distance. When he woke, he was no longer on the Korean peninsula. The rolling of the ship's hull, English broadcasts spliced into shouts in various accents, and the occasional clang of metal all told him he had been taken away from the battlefield. Some said they were being sent to Japan. Others said they were to be locked up on an island somewhere in the Pacific. And someone, in a voice so low it was barely audible, said, "They say some prisoners will be sent to the U.S. mainland for research." Those 3 words were like a block of ice shoved into his chest. For research. He still remembered the stories that had circulated during the colonial era. Stories of university dissection rooms, of medical teams collecting bodies at the edges of battlefields, of people stripped of their names in the name of science. The war had ended, flags had changed, but the fear associated with research had never truly left that land. By the time he was actually pushed down from the transport plane and saw the winter sky over Maryland, combat was already far behind him. In front of him lay rows of low white buildings, their clean glass windows reflecting a pale light. It was a military-affiliated general hospital on U.S. soil, assigned to receive foreign wounded and POWs, operated procedurally according to the civilian medical system. For the administrative record, he was no longer a first lieutenant of any company, but just a number, an injured foreign POW to be entered into the ledger. He did not know how he would be handled now. He only knew that once he entered a building of this scale, his fate would no longer be decided at the barrel of a gun, but on sheets of paper, on signatures, on forms he could not read. The first time he was wheeled past the doors of the operating room, the red light was not on. It was only a brief stillness after a routine surgery. Nurses were putting instruments in order. The air held the mingled scent of disinfectant and metal, with the raw smell of blood washed away to a faint trace. For those familiar with modern hospitals, that smell meant safety and cleanliness. For Yoo Jung-wook, who had never set foot in a real operating theater, that smell meant only one thing: cutting has happened here. As they drew close to the door, his fingers dug into the stretcher, veins standing out on the backs of his hands. His eyes flinched away from the glaring circle of light above the table. He was absolutely certain that the moment he lay on that platform, he would cease to exist as an officer and become nothing but some kind of specimen. "I am a first lieutenant," he ground out in Korean to the interpreter at his side. "I have the right to refuse." The interpreter glanced at him and simply relayed his resistance to the doctors. The doctor shrugged and wrote a few English words in the chart. "Refuses surgery. For now." That was the first time Ryu saw his own refusal treated not as an uprising to be crushed, but as a single line of notation. In the old order, refusal was a form of power. In the new order, refusal was merely an item on a list. That sentence would come back to him many times in the future, but at that moment it was only a vague unease. At first, his wound was only cleaned, stitched, and bandaged. The doctor explained that this was a temporary measure and that they would have to operate soon to remove the remaining shrapnel. Otherwise, infection would eventually swallow the entire area of his flank. He could not understand all the English, but words like infection and danger were repeated again and again. Even so, he held fast to his belief. You want to experiment on prisoners. In his imagination, modern medicine was not a way to save lives. It was a front hall leading to the interrogation chamber. Anesthesia was not for taking away pain, but for taking away resistance. When the hospital printed out his first long-term follow-up treatment schedule, he stared at the paper for a long time. It was a standard form: diagnosis, recommended surgery, follow-up dates, imaging appointments, attending physician's signature, projected recovery timeline. Every box on the page was printed neatly, leaving no blank spaces for casual additions or deletions. For the doctors, it was a tool to ensure continuity of care. For him, it looked more like a schedule of execution: which day he would be pushed into the interrogation room, which day he would receive the next round of unknown drugs, which day the questioning would deepen. He crushed the paper into a ball and hurled it at the trash can with a gesture that was childish, yet absolutely determined. An enemy's goodwill is often more terrifying than an enemy's weapons. He had heard that line countless times in political study sessions before the war. Now it reappeared on the white walls of the hospital, with its meaning reversed. What pushed him toward collapse was not the enemy's malice, but the absence of visible malice. In the first week, he was wheeled past that operating room door almost every day. That door felt like a kind of boundary of fate. On one side was the world he knew: class, orders, refusal, confrontation. On the other side was a world he could not understand. Blinding lights, procedures with no visible purpose, calm steps that leaned toward nothing and no one. Each time he passed, his whole body tensed as if some unseen force had nailed him in place. A nurse pushed an instrument cart by, the wheels whispering across the floor in a smooth, regular sound. The metal tools were wrapped in white cloth, only a sliver of silver glinting through. That sliver of light summoned memories of colonial-era operating tables, those never-proven tales passed from mouth to mouth in the countryside. Prisoners anesthetized and dissected, human bodies used to test drugs, army doctors wearing calm expressions where compassion should have been. He had heard too many unverified rumors, and in a world without knowledge, rumor was fact. His body began to burn with fever. The skin around his wound turned red and hot, as if a slow fire was spreading beneath the surface. The doctor came again to his bedside, pressing a tongue depressor on his tongue to check his responses, touching around the wound with a metal tool, watching his pupils for change. The interpreter conveyed the doctor's words. "The infection is worsening. We must operate." Ryu's reply was direct, stubborn, almost obsessive. "You want me unconscious so you can do something to me?" The doctor looked at him, his eyes expressionless, his voice calm to the point of coldness. "If we wanted to harm you, we wouldn't need surgery." The sentence was like ice water poured into his chest, so cold he could not breathe for a moment. He could not understand this emotionless explanation. In the system he had grown up in, the absence of emotion usually meant cruelty. Here, the absence of emotion meant that the procedure itself did not need to persuade anyone. The doctor simply stated facts. He did not plead, threaten, or cajole. He simply recorded Ryu's refusal as it was. Refused. Again. In this system, you are not persuaded. You are recorded. This was his first real taste of the weight of structure. A few days later, the fever dragged him into a hazy state of hallucination. Again and again he dreamed of being pushed into the light, being held down, being questioned, being drowned by anesthesia that left him unable to move. He struggled in his sleep, only to wake and find no one touching him at all. The nurse had only wiped away his sweat, changed his damp cloth, and placed a warm compress on his forehead. Her motions were meticulous, without any extraneous glance. That made him even more uneasy. When no one covets you, it also means no one depends on you. In the old world, he had defended himself with a kind of paranoia. In the new world, his paranoia was quietly bypassed, neither challenged nor debated, simply written down on paper. The hospital arranged a psychological evaluation for him. He was taken to a small room containing only a table, 2 chairs, and a cup of warm water. The walls were so clean they seemed stripped of all emotion. An American military psychologist sat across from him and asked in steady English, "Why do you fear the surgery?" The question was not sharp in itself, but it jabbed like a needle into flesh he had never dared touch. He opened his mouth and found no words. He could shout, "You want to interrogate me?" or "You want to study me?" but he had never organized the real reason for himself. He feared losing consciousness because in every world he had known, losing consciousness meant losing dignity, losing status, losing any chance of being treated as human. He managed only half a sentence. "You will, while I'm unconscious. You will." But halfway through he heard himself falter because he suddenly remembered that American soldier who had been brought back from the brink. The scene was nailed into his mind. That night, he had been sitting on a chair in the hallway, waiting for his dressing to be changed when a stretcher rushed past. The nurse shouted, "He's crashing!" Then came a flurry of footsteps. The soldier's abdomen was wrapped in thick bandages, dark stains spreading across them. Ryu instinctively shrank back, sure that some cruelty was about to unfold. But the doctors did not interrogate, did not bark out demands, did not use force. They were only trying to save him. They raised the soldier's head, checked his pupils. A nurse pressed a hand on his shoulder. The anesthetist inserted a line with practiced speed, then shouted, "Move! Move!" The stretcher was pushed into the operating room. The red light came on. The doors closed. In that moment there was no trace of an interrogation. He waited for screaming. Outside, there was only the steady sound of equipment. He waited for the tone of urgent questioning. There was only the exchange of medical terms. He waited to see a corpse pushed back out. An hour later, what he saw was the soldier's chest rising and falling, the oxygen mask fogging and clearing with each breath. That was not an interrogation room. It was a place where life was stitched back together. This image shattered the foundation of all his obsessions, the logic on which he had built his life. Power equals danger. Light equals coercion. Metal equals harm. Cracked quietly in that instant. So the enemy's operating room really is an operating room. The thought kept him from sleeping all night. But he still refused to admit that the world he feared was collapsing. The next day he still said, "I refuse." Only this time his voice was softer, more like he was speaking to himself than to anyone else. When the infection spread to the point that he could hardly stand, he knew he had run out of ground. He was not being forced. Reality had simply driven him to the edge. For the first time he asked the doctor, "The surgery. How will it be done?" It was the first time he had replaced confrontation with a question. The doctor patiently explained the steps, the anesthesia, the risks, the expected outcome. Not a word carried emotion or threat. He suddenly realized medicine did not require his belief, only his understanding. The system did not require his submission, only his entry into its track. On the night before the surgery, he was told to shower, to clean the wound, and to change into a fresh surgical gown. The nurse tied the strings for him. His hands were shaking, as if he was standing before a new reality that did not demand resistance. Surgery is not to make you submit, but to make the pain withdraw. He whispered it to himself again and again. At last, the doors of the operating room opened slowly before him. White light flooded the floor. Metal instruments were laid out in perfect order. A cool, almost austere smell spread in the air, the scent of disinfectant and filtered air. His heartbeat echoed in the emptiness of the room. "You will feel sleepy," the anesthetist said. The words were as soft as a breeze. When drowsiness washed over him, he did not struggle for the first time. His last thought before losing consciousness was, "Perhaps I'm not being taken into a shadow, but into a system." That was his entrance into a new world. When he woke again, it was to the soft and steady drip of fluid. The liquid in the bottle above his bed fell drop by drop at a constant rhythm, spreading a pattern that did not belong to the battlefield slowly through his body. His vision was a blur of white at first, then it focused gradually on the ceiling of the ward. He did not know how long he had been unconscious. He only knew that the stabbing pain in his chest had been replaced by a dull pressure, one without malice, without the implications of interrogation, just the feeling of organs that had been stitched and were now learning their new shape. A nurse came in with a clipboard. She checked his breathing, measured his pulse, and wrote the numbers into a new form. Her movements were neither gentle nor harsh, just routine, repetitive, without distinction. He suddenly realized that he was no longer a POW who refused treatment, and no longer a first lieutenant. In her eyes, he was simply post-operative day 3, patient 4217. "You woke up very well," the nurse said. The interpreter added, "The surgery went smoothly." He stared at the ceiling and did not respond immediately. Smoothly. He had never imagined he would come back alive from under those lights. "Did I really get saved?" he heard his own hoarse voice ask. The nurse paused, clearly not understanding what lay behind his question. She only nodded lightly, as if dealing with a completely ordinary matter. She did not sigh in relief or express joy, because in this system, saving a life was not a miracle. It was a procedure. In the old world, saving someone's life was a favor. In this world, saving someone's life was a process. When the doctor came to change his dressing, his movements were extremely careful. He explained possible post-operative complications, signs of infection, positions he should avoid, and the steps of rehabilitation over the coming weeks. His tone was like explaining the weather, so even that Ryu could no longer tell whether he is saving me or he is simply doing his job. At the end, the doctor wrote in the chart, "Healing well," and left without the slightest flourish. This uncelebrated rescue sent a strange tremor through him. He had grown up in a world where one always had to prove loyalty to superiors, where every act of survival carried extra meaning. Here, his continued existence had no political value. He was not being preserved as a resource, nor was he being disposed of as an enemy. He was simply being repaired as the system moved forward. Sometimes, harder to endure than the goodwill is a neutrality with no ulterior motive. On the 5th day after surgery, he was told to begin trying to sit up and to attend his first post-operative follow-up. The nurse brought him a new follow-up schedule. Exact dates, tests, and imaging appointments were printed clearly across it. The paper itself was nothing special, yet it stood like a line dividing two worlds. "Why fix everything like this?" he asked for the first time. The interpreter relayed the question. "So that you don't fall through the cracks of recovery," the doctor replied. "Cracks?" He repeated the word softly, as if understanding it for the first time. In his world, anyone who fell behind immediately became sacrifice, loss, disposable. In this unfamiliar system, the track was something that no one, not even an enemy, was meant to fall out of easily. The system was not adjusted for individuals. It forced everyone to move in the same rhythm. For the first time, he realized that he was being held up by a structure more stable than any country, army, or ideology he had ever known. By the 10th day after surgery, he could walk along the rail with support. The hospital transferred him to a light activity area, a wide rehabilitation corridor where winter light lay in long silver bars on the floor. There stood patients speaking every kind of language: American soldiers, South Korean troops, captured Chinese volunteers, even a German POW. All wore the same recovery gowns. All followed the same instructions. All took their turns for examination. No one received special treatment. No one was deliberately ignored. Watching those unfamiliar faces, Ryu felt a disorienting sensation rise in his chest. Some of these people had traded fire with him on the battlefield. Some, like him, had been bound to the ladders of old systems. Some came from lands he had never seen. Here, they had all lost the identities of enemy and class. They were only post-operative Day X recovering patients. It dawned on him that being de-identified by a system was not necessarily a form of stripping away, but a kind of rewriting. The nurse handed him another form. Next appointment, March 12th. The date was printed with stark clarity. He looked down at that line of numbers and felt a weight he had never known. It was neither an order nor a threat. Yet it was more solid than an order, more inexorable than a threat, because it represented a future that could be predicted. The old order had taught him. The future is decided by superiors. The new system showed him. The future is decided by process, and process would not change because of who he was. It would not punish him for once refusing surgery. It would not reward him for once being an officer. It would simply continue, steady and unbending, like a cold river flowing in a straight bed. In the 3rd week after his operation, he was told he would be going to City Hall to register for disability benefits. The news unsettled him even more than the word surgery had the first time. He could not understand it. Why would an enemy country give benefits to a prisoner of war? It's regulation, the interpreter said, and nothing more. Just a regulation? A regulation that compelled an enemy state to assume costs for him? For the first time, he felt a kind of irrefutable absurdity, a force that pushed his worldview right to the edge of a cliff. They put him in a vehicle and drove to City Hall. A grey building appeared at the end of the road, plainer than the hospital, and even calmer. Inside, he saw a long line. In that line stood an American colonel, civilians in plain clothes, a black veteran leaning on a cane, a South Korean soldier in a rumpled uniform, and a German POW with a number tag similar to his own hanging from his neck. All stood in the same queue. All held the same application form. No priority, no rank, no distinction between enemy and ally, no favoritism, no contempt. In that moment, Ryu finally understood what institutional equality meant. In his homeland, equality was a slogan. In this hall, equality was a rule. His breathing suddenly quickened. It felt as if something hard and unfamiliar had been wedged into his chest, and he could not decide whether to retreat or move forward. He watched the American colonel filling out a form at the front. Halfway through, the officer realized he had missed a page. The clerk said calmly, "You need to get a new form." The colonel hesitated a moment, then silently returned to the back of the line. In that instant, Ryu's world completely collapsed. Rank ceased to function. Differences ceased to function. His own obsessions ceased to function. When the clerk finally called his number, "Next, 4217, he relaxed his shoulders for the first time and walked up to the window with steps that were almost compliant, yet not humiliating. "Injury review. Please place your documents here," the clerk said. There was no hostility, no kindness, only the motion of a process continuing. He laid his papers on the counter and watched them stamped with a single word: received. In that moment, he thought of the American soldier saved under the operating light, thought of the faces he had seen in the rehabilitation corridor, thought of the clear handwriting on his follow-up forms, thought of the doctor's flat tone, thought of the nurse's emotionless care, thought of the interrogations and inquests that had never materialized. He felt a heavy warmth melting inside his chest, not a comforting warmth, but the strange ache that comes when a world is being sewn back together. Almost without knowing why, he whispered words so soft they were barely audible. "So, this is what treatment is." When he returned from City Hall that evening, the sky was low, like a heavy metal plate pressed over the city. Pine trees along the road swayed in the wind, their branches creaking. Ryu sat in the back of the military car. Light slid backwards past the window, and he felt as if he were being driven, for the first time, toward a world that held neither open hostility nor promised shelter. Back in the ward, the nurse handed him his evening medication and casually stuck a new follow-up reminder card to his chart. She did not notice how deeply shaken he still was. To her, he was only another patient progressing to the next stage of the system. "Remember, March 12th. Don't miss it," she said before leaving. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the card. The hardest thing for a person to bear is not cruel treatment, but fair treatment. He had never imagined that one day fairness would become a force that shattered his old world. He had even less imagined that a set of institutional tracks built by an enemy country would become a door in his life that he could not push closed. That night, he tossed restlessly in his bed. Images replayed over and over in his mind. The red light of the operating room, the hand of an American soldier's wife tightening around her rosary, the slight heaving of a black veteran's shoulders as he waited for his review, the colonel hesitating as he returned to the end of the line after filling his form wrong, the German prisoner standing in that same queue, calm as his number was called. Every image seemed to announce the same fact. Here, hierarchy had been discarded, difference had been dissolved, fate was recorded on paper, not in the shifting moods of any one person. In the old world, paper was dangerous. It might be evidence of a crime, a list, an order. In this new world, paper meant that the future could be foreseen. At 3 in the morning, he sat up in bed. The light outside was faint. Only the low murmur of nurses changing shifts drifted down the hallway. He stared at the reminder card for a long time and suddenly understood that everything he had relied on for decades meant nothing here. He had believed that loyalty brings protection, that refusal brings dignity, that status creates distance. Yet in this system, he did not even have the chance to fight for the right to be treated differently. For the first time, he grasped that safety sometimes comes from the absence of exceptions. The next day, he began actively cooperating with rehabilitation. He no longer avoided equipment, no longer flinched from the white lights that once unnerved him. He followed the nurse's guidance, cautiously practicing bending, stretching, breathing. His movements were stiff, but each step carried an honesty he had never known before, not submission to the system, but an admission of his own ignorance. The rehab ward was always filled with wounded men from many fronts. They did not speak, but they watched one another. Ryu realized for the first time that silent observation often redefines a person's place more deeply than words. One day, he saw the American soldier who had been saved in that emergency surgery walking slowly with his wife's support. Both their silhouettes looked fragile, yet they carried a solid weight, the weight of people who had been held and protected by a system. Ryu lowered his eyes, unsure whether what he felt was shame or relief. He finally admitted to himself, danger and safety could be defined by structure, not only by the muzzle of a gun. Months later, his health record was marked eligible for transfer to POW rehabilitation camp. He was sent to a POW administration center on the U.S. East Coast. The barracks there were neat, the rations regular, medical follow-up continued, and even educational programs were scheduled for fixed hours every week. Life in the camp was far simpler than at the front, yet more stable than anything he had imagined. The first time he entered the compound, he saw a group of Japanese prisoners assembling wooden tables outside. In another area, Italian prisoners tended a vegetable garden. Over the camp radio, a music program from the United States mainland was playing. Near a wooden storeroom, an American cook was handing out bread and army coffee. Everyone lived within their tracks. He suddenly understood that in this system the fighting had stopped, but the institutions had not. What decided the fate of the post-war years was not the victor's mood, but the victor's procedures. That night he wrote the first lines that truly belonged to himself in the barracks. They were not addressed to a superior, they were not a self-criticism, they were not a political report. For the first time, he wrote for himself. He wrote, I have never seen a system that does not change its operation because of a person's identity. It does not even need me to believe in it. It only needs me to comply with it. Perhaps this is another form of civilization. The paper was yellowed. His handwriting trembled. But for the first time in his life, his pen moved without fear. Over the next few months, he was taken back to the hospital repeatedly for follow-up visits. Each time he saw the same procedures, the same instruments, the same lack of distinction in treatment. He no longer grew tense. He no longer asked, why? The follow-up schedule that had once terrified him had now become the thing he trusted most, because it represented a safety that would not suddenly collapse. He finally understood. Treatment was not the stitching of a wound, it was the stitching of a world. His last follow-up before repatriation was scheduled for a spring afternoon. The sky was clear. Wind blew in from the coast, carrying a faint, damp salt smell. On the lawn outside the hospital, green shoots were beginning to show. Pigeons perched on the eaves, their short calls answering one another. Ryu sat in the waiting area, holding his worn follow-up booklet. The edges of the pages curled slightly like plants that had survived a long winter while still obeying a rhythm. 4217. The nurse called his number. His movements no longer carried the old defensiveness, nor did he exaggerate his caution. When he rose, his steps were steady, natural, even touched with the faintest trace of composure. He realized he had grown used to this rhythm, returning on scheduled dates, undergoing tests according to protocol, being filed in order by the system. No surprises, no crises. This lack of fluctuation had once made him feel suffocated. Now, it felt like precious air. The doctor leafed through his imaging results, checked the scar, and recorded new data. His tone remained flat, holding neither praise nor reproach. The wound is stable. No additional treatment needed. As always, it was not a judgment, but a statement of fact. The doctor wrote a few more words, then handed back the booklet. After repatriation, your case will be archived here. The system will keep your file. Ryu looked at the folder and felt a peculiar weight. Even his departure had already been planned and arranged by the system. In all his previous life, he had never believed himself worth remembering. Now, an enemy's system would preserve the record of his healing. He wanted to ask, why? But the question stuck in his throat. The doctor offered no explanation, merely nodded gently as if submitting a completion report to a protocol. In the face of the system, no emotion was required. Inside the system, no explanation was necessary. As he stepped out of the consultation room, light streamed down from the skylight into the corridor, bright yet not blinding. For the first time, he no longer saw that white light as a threat, but as a symbol of order. Order that would not change suddenly, not fall suddenly silent, not betray him without warning. That evening, he was sent back to the camp. The flagpole hummed softly in the wind. He crossed the yard and saw Japanese prisoners doing carpentry, Italian prisoners working in the garden, a few Korean POWs sitting on benches in the sun, and farther away, a phonograph playing jazz from the Second World War era. The air in the camp carried a gentle, indiscriminate everydayness. He understood that beyond the battlefield, there existed a world that did not divide itself by enemy and friend. That night, in the dim barracks light, he wrote his last passage before going home. He wrote slowly, as if carefully weighing each character. War taught me that only by dividing people into enemy and friend can one know who one is. The system taught me that only by placing people under the same rules can one know what one is. I thought the enemy wanted to destroy me. Later I understood. What truly needed to be destroyed was the old world I had brought with me. The paper lay quietly on the table. For the first time he felt that words could hold both fragility and strength. Several weeks later, he boarded the repatriation ship. Morning mist rose over the harbor like gauze draped across the horizon. He glanced back. The hospital with its white walls and red bricks stood quietly where it was, like a stone with no feelings and no intention of leaving. He remembered how he had once feared its lights and metal, and how he now almost depended on them. He thought of the first medical form that had terrified him, now tucked into his records like a talisman. He thought of the long line at City Hall, of the windows that had stripped rank of its power, and how they had become the starting point for his understanding of the world. He realized that safety did not come from being favored, but from being included in a structure. Dignity did not come from identity, but from a process that did not change for anyone. The meaning of treatment was not to sew up wounds, but to sew people back together. As the ship pulled away from the pier, the waves struck the hull in slow, regular beats, like the rhythm inscribed on his medical forms. Stable, predictable, beyond the reach of individual will. On land like that of North Hamgyong, he had never known such a rhythm. In the midst of combat, hunger, humiliation, and orders, he had never understood such order. Now he did. It was not the enemy's guns that had remade him, but the enemy's procedures. Wind rose off the sea. He closed his eyes. In that moment, he finally accepted. The operating table was not an interrogation room. The system was not a trap. To be treated equally was, for the first time in his life, a true release.